gruesome deaths, creepy princes, and homicidal moms, Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one of the most beloved animated films ever made. But in some versions of the fairy tale, the subject matter is dark and twisted. The 1819 Grimm version of Snow White begins like many fairy tales, with a queen wishing for a daughter. After pricking her finger while sewing, 3 drops of blood land on the snow, and the queen is struck by the beautiful contrast, thinking, "If only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood in this frame." Soon after, the queen is blessed with the birth of a daughter, but the queen dies during childbirth. Within a year, the king remarries a beautiful woman.
And though she was beautiful, she was evil.
The new queen worries someone will eclipse her beauty, so she asks her magic mirror if she is still the most beautiful. All is well until Snow White becomes more beautiful, and then there's hell to pay. In this version of the Grimm story, the king is never mentioned again, leaving us to wonder if he also died, or if he allows his new wife to mistreat Snow White. Disney's version skips Snow White's origins, setting the stage by telling us Snow White lives with her wicked stepmother, who dresses her in rags and makes her work as a maid. There's no mention of Snow White's parents in the Disney classic, leading audience members to assume both parents are dead. In Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the evil queen asks the huntsman to take Snow White into the woods to kill her.
You know the penalty if you fail.
The queen is a distrustful person and tells the huntsman to bring her Snow White's heart as proof the girl is dead. Of course, the huntsman can't bring himself to kill the beautiful child and allows her to run away into the woods. He then kills a wild boar and takes its heart to the queen. In some versions of the fairy tale, it's Snow White's liver and lungs that the queen requests, while in other early versions, it's her heart she asks the huntsman to bring back. The gruesome detail Disney left out of the story is that the wicked queen cooks and eats the organs the huntsman brings to her. The Grimm version reads, "The cook had to boil them with salt, and the wicked woman ate them, supposing that she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver." Cannibalism certainly is dark and twisted. Disney would never explore such depraved themes, but this macabre element of the story was explored in Snow White and the Huntsman. In that film, the magic mirror tells Queen Ravenna that eating the heart of Snow White will restore her waning magical powers, thus returning her eternal youth and beauty.
You shall never again weaken or age.
This version was far darker and more mature than previous big-screen adaptations, and a sign of the return to dark fairy tale retellings we would see in the coming years. In the Grimm version, the evil queen tries to kill Snow White 3 times, 4 if you count the huntsman's failed attempt. In Disney's animated version, the queen only tries to kill Snow White once with a poisoned apple. Disney streamlined the plot for 2 reasons. Time constraints are the most obvious, but they also probably cut out the first 2 attempts on Snow White's life because being tricked 3 times made her seem more gullible than sweet. The first time the queen tries to kill Snow White, the queen dresses as a peddler, selling Snow White new laces for her corset. She cinches the laces so tightly that Snow White ceases breathing and falls down dead. The 7 dwarves return home and cut the laces, and Snow White revives. During the second attempt, the queen disguises herself as another peddler and kills Snow White with a poisoned comb. The 7 dwarves remove the comb when they return home, and Snow White wakes up. The third time, the queen disguises herself as an older woman and kills Snow White with a poison apple. She tricks Snow White into eating the apple by making one side tainted and one side safe, and taking a bite of the apple to entice Snow White into eating her half. The Disney animated version is essentially the same. In Snow White and the Huntsman, Queen Ravenna uses an illusion to disguise herself as William, someone Snow White trusts from her childhood.
Love always betrays us.
In the Disney animated classic, Snow White and her prince meet once before she runs away to the woods. He discovers her singing while working at the palace and approaches her. It's love at first sight, but Snow White is embarrassed that she's dressed in rags and runs away. When the evil queen gives Snow White the poisoned apple, the queen entices Snow White to eat it by telling her it's a wishing apple.
Now take the apple, dearie, and make a wish.
Snow White wishes her prince would come for her before taking a bite and falling down dead. When Snow White awakens, from her perspective, it's almost as if the wishing apple worked. In the Grimm version, the prince comes upon Snow White in her glass coffin in the forest, surrounded by the 7 dwarves who are still mourning her. The prince is so taken with Snow White's beauty that he asks the dwarves if he can buy her, but the dwarves say no. The prince then adopts a new tactic by appealing to their emotions. He tells them, "Then give it to me, for I cannot live without being able to see Snow White. I will honor her and respect her as my most cherished one." Shockingly, the dwarves aren't creeped out, and they allow the prince to take Snow White's glass coffin with him. The prince and Snow White meet for the first time after she awakens. In the Grimm version of the fairy tale, Snow White is only 7 years old when her beauty eclipses the queen's. This is when she's taken to the woods to die at the hands of the huntsman, but is spared and allowed to run away. Although she lives with the 7 dwarves long enough for the evil queen to make 3 attempts on her life, she is no more than 10 years old by the time she's in her glass coffin.
So we made a glass cover for Snow White.
In the Disney version of the story, Snow White is a teenager, making her romantic interest in the prince more understandable and less creepy. The Grimm version of the story makes the prince look like a predator who covets the beauty of a child. And it isn't just the prince that's weird. The queen is so jealous of a literal child's beauty that she's driven to homicidal madness. In the 1819 Grimm version, the prince is allowed to take Snow White's coffin, but one of his servants accidentally drops it during their journey back to the palace. The impact dislodges the poisoned apple from Snow White's throat, and she awakens before agreeing to marry the prince. But in an earlier Grimm version, the prince's obsession with Snow White is even more creepy. He's so fixated on her beauty that he can't even eat unless he's in her presence. The prince has his servants carry her coffin around the palace, so he is never far from her. Eventually, one of the prince's servants opens the coffin and strikes Snow White in frustration. The blow dislodges the poison apple, reviving her, and she agrees to marry the prince. There is no mention of true love's kiss in either of the Brothers Grimm versions of Snow White. Disney popularized the idea that true love's kiss is a cure for a sleeping curse, and would soon use it again in its animated adaptation of Sleeping Beauty. The true love's kiss trope is used differently in Snow White and the Huntsman. It's the huntsman's kiss that awakens Snow White, leaving their connection ambiguous while suggesting there might be a love triangle brewing between Snow White, the huntsman, and William. In Disney's animated movie, the queen goes out by falling to her death while disguised as an old woman. In the Grimm version, however, the wicked queen's death is far more gruesome. The queen is invited to the wedding of a prince and his princess. She consults with her mirror before attending the wedding, only to discover Snow White is alive. Despite her fear, the queen still attends the wedding, desperate to see Snow White with her own eyes. When the queen arrives, they force her to wear iron shoes glowing red-hot from a fire, and she dances herself to death in agony. You can see why Disney left this out. Snow White and the Huntsman returns to the more gruesome folktales and adult themes. In this dark iteration of the story, Queen Ravenna dies at Snow White's hands during a fight between the two women. After it appears Ravenna has the upper hand, Snow White stabs her with a dagger, and the once proud and beautiful queen dies as an old woman, leaving behind a shriveled shell. Both the Grimm and Disney versions depict the Seven Dwarfs as honest miners who dig for gems and ore, but in other versions, the Seven Dwarfs are actually thieves or robbers. In 2012's Mirror Mirror, for instance, Snow White takes up with robbers who are also dwarves.
Empty your pockets!
Meanwhile, in the series Once Upon a Time, Snow White teams up with a band of robbers while on the run from the queen. In this fairy tale series, Snow White is spirited and rebellious rather than sweet and wholesome. We also see Snow White teaming up with robber dwarves in Snow White and the Huntsman. They fight by her side to free the kingdom from Queen Ravenna's clutches. Robbers and thieves coming to Snow White's aid are a common motif in many versions of the folktale. Disney's 2025 live-action remake of Snow White isn't a direct retelling of the studio's classic animated film.
This is my kingdom.
You dare to disobey me?
It imports a few surprising details from some of the different versions of the Snow White fairy tale, like Snow White's passionate speech about her stepmother's attempts to execute her, a staple of the Grimm version. This take on Snow White also isn't interested in sitting by and letting the prince enact justice on her behalf. As in 2012's Snow White and the Huntsman, Snow White ends up raising an army to defeat her wicked stepmother. But this time, she's joined in her fight by Jonathan, a cynical robber who stands in for Snow's handsome prince. This is a direct nod to the Belgian and Italian versions of the tale, where Snow White finds refuge with a group of thieves after being expelled from the palace. In Disney's 2025 remake, Snow White believes that her father might be alive and hopes to find him and raise a revolution against the evil queen. That's not the case, as the queen eventually reveals that she killed Snow White's father. But there are versions of the original fairy tale in which at least one of Snow White's parents lives, if only to bully her the same way that her stepmother does in other versions. And usually, it's Snow White's mother. In many variations of Snow White, the evil queen is Snow White's biological mother, unsubtly exploring a mother's angst over being supplanted by her lovely young daughter in life. which makes the queen's jealousy and hatred so much more disturbing. In other tales spun off from the legend, like the Scots Gaelic take or Italian versions of the story, Snow White's mother is the person who torments her, not her stepmother. After all, there's nothing darker than being hunted down by your homicidal mom.